I guess I'll tell you about how I met my wife the first time. She really wasn't my wife when I first met her, but she was a model and she came to the studio as a casting. I was photographing a friend of mine, Debbie, with her pet Morticia at the time. A couple of years later, I met this lady at a social event, and I had to get over a few hurdles. First of all, she didn't get the gig she came for, so she was already pissed off at me. And then she had to get over that first impression of this long-haired hippie dude photographing a naked, tattooed lady with a big snake wrapped around her. There can be a contradiction between what we look like and who we are. By the way, this is the guy that you meet coming in here with tells you the 18-minute rule, you know. So if you're tall, slim, and good-looking like most of you out there, you'll probably do better than if you had even a little better education. So my thought was, why don't we throw a few plastic surgery electives into your curriculum to help with the bottom line a little bit? I've been fascinated by this medieval study called Physiognomies. It's kind of a science. And it's the who you are is what you look like thing, or more precisely, your personality resembles the animal you most resemble. I made this contraption to kind of illustrate the concept, but in urban cultures, we tend to be more affected by first impressions. Back in the day in Salem, you could have been burnt at the stake if your eyes were too far apart. Whereas in rural cultures, reliability can be a powerful aphrodisiac for potential mate. In a sense, who are we really, and do we look like who we are? That's kind of where my world is. The project that I'm working on is called The Vanishing Cultures. I made this big camera and fascinating American cultures, and there's a cool exhibit concept, and it's all wraps around my passion for portraiture. Normally, when you get your picture taken, you take a lot of pictures, you pick one, it's cool. But my world, I live in one picture per subject. It reminds me of a scene from The Deer Hunter, where De Niro holds up a bullet and he says, "This is this." To level the playing field, he had one bullet per hunting season. I photographed this guy, Bill Cullerton, one of the most amazing men I've ever met. He was a World War II war hero. He was the last survivor of the elite Dragon Squadron. He was a triple ace, shot down 28 enemy planes until he was shot down. And when he was shot down, he was captured by stormtroopers and he was executed on the ground. He survived the execution. When he came to my studio, he was 90s. He weighed about 85 pounds. He was on oxygen. And I looked at him and I heard the story. I said, I've got to do something. I lowered the camera. I made the light a little bit more heroic. And I went and I put my arm around him and I said, go someplace in your mind that you feel great. Close your eyes. And when you open your eyes, I'll take the picture. I did, and I sent him a small version a few days later, and he called me up. He's like a little kid. He said, wow, this is so cool. He says, when I look in the mirror, I don't look like this, but I look like this in my mind. So I said, you don't have to worry about the mirror. I got an 8-foot print for you. They were over in the morning, and they picked it up, and it was cool, and that doesn't happen all the time, but that's really special when it does. So what would the world look like if there were no pictures? They say if your house was burning, one of the first things you do is rescue your photos. We have backup systems on our computers. But we're reaching a saturation point because during our lifetime we will have seen over 1 billion images. Your grandfather probably would have had one roll of film a year, 12 pictures. After summer vacation, he brings it into the Photoshop, picks it up for Christmas. Every picture ends up in a family album or in a frame. Now we shoot thousands and most end up in the trash. We save a couple. The thing about film photography that I'd like to differentiate, a lot of people ask me why I'm still using film. I'm not a dinosaur. I mean, I do work with digital, you know, but there's a difference, you know. A film negative you cannot alter, so there's an honesty and integrity about that that's amazing. I make the metaphor, if your father has a birthday and you send him an email, it's cool, it's like digital, it's perfect, spell check. Now what about you get your old fountain pen up and you write him a letter? He sees that letter and there's going to be a warm feeling with that. In the 1880s, because of the reliability of photography, you could be looked like that, you know, sitting on the stool. But photography was admissible evidence in court, whereas now in the UK, you really have to have a disclaimer on pictures that have been altered, almost like a cigarette pack. I had a friend of mine that worked digitally on one of these diet commercials, and they literally shot the before and after in the same day with the help of Photoshop, the warp tool, some airbrushed abs, and whatever. I can remember the first time I ever went in the darkroom and developed a picture. Most of you have never experienced that because you've lived in the digital world, but it's so cool. I had an uncle that was a photographer, and in the darkroom, one of the chief components was a record player with a stack of jazz albums. It was so cool. And I tell you, I always doing portraits, so you're looking in the developer and this thing is like magic every time. And I still do it, and I'll tell you, it's still like magic. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words, which is cool. But what about a picture that ended a war? How many words is that worth? Pictures, I can't think of another technology that's affected the 20th century more than photography. You can say, what about a rocket to the moon or a cell phone? What's the first thing they did when they got the moon? They started taking pictures. Cell phone, they put a camera in it, whatever. So pictures are not inconsequential. So let's put our insane hats on and rock and roll a little bit. I'll take you through some history. Photography now is coming on the 200th anniversary in a couple of years of the camera, which is what inspired my project. And in the 1840s, pictures started coming out where people like actually take pictures, and then the painters were freaking big time, because they got big egos and everything. So they were looking at these pictures and they said, we can't compete with this shit. So they said, we're going to make our own movement. So they created Impressionism, which is very romantic. Now the photographers, well, they're getting a case of the jaws, so they're looking, well, wow. They took all their great German lenses and they started slathering Vaseline around them so they could make their pictures look blurry like the painters. So painters and photographers have been chasing each other's tail forever until, say, the 1960s when the photorealist movement began. And that's when painters literally copied photographs exactly, flaws and all. I mean, if it was blurry, if there was pink eye, whatever. And the best of them was Chuck Close. And I remember seeing this picture, a self-portrait, or this picture right here is of Philip Glass, but in the Museum of Modern Art when I was a student. And I'd never seen a photograph that had at that kind of impact at that size. And it left an indelible mark on me. And until I created the big camera, I never was able to achieve that. But what we learn when we look at a painting closer, we get more abstract. When we look at a photograph closer, we get more real and more sensitive. What art teaches us in general, though, is that it's the flaws that distinguish us. So we embrace our flaws. I had a good friend, Danny, who worked in the film industry out in the West Coast. And he looked a little like Brad Pitt, really good-looking guy, and had a little trouble getting dates. We could never figure out why. He was a hunter, and he had a hunting accident one time, and he was attacked by a bear. And the bear put a big scar on his face, and it left a flaw, and he had a story. We called him Bearface. And I think he probably looked more approachable, but all of a sudden his love life was on steroids. So, and photography teaches us a lot about history because we remember things through photographs. Young Ralph Lauren, when he, even when he was a young man, they could afford whatever they wanted, but he wanted to buy clothes that had worn knees and worn elbows before he ever put them on. And we buy furniture that's been pre-distressed, and we have programs for our computer that make our pictures look old. So in a way, we're counterfeit our lives to make it look like we've been around a little bit longer. Maybe we're trying to create that flaw that makes us a little bit more interesting. But there are lots of photographers around. I'm sure all of you guys are photographers. In China alone, there's 100 million photographers, if you can imagine that. But somehow it's never reached the top of any great professions list. It looks too easy or something. I know my father thought I was a drug dealer when I became successful. He says, kid, it ain't exactly brain surgery, I did photograph a neurosurgeon one time, and he really loved his picture for some reason. And he calls up and he says, what would it take to get a crash course in photography? I've always wanted to do that. And I said, well, I'll just trade you even up for a crash course in brain surgery, because why would you want to screw around with that myself? Anyway, it looks easy, I gotta say, but so photography also has an honesty that turns around and bites you in the butt. Me particularly, I've been doing it for a long time, I still get nailed. You see something and the camera sees it exactly. When I see it, my mind embellishes it, so I constantly have to put that check and balance in work. I know a painter finds this pretty girl, Miss Jones, she's a model. He gets her in and he wants her to be Cleopatra. And he paints some pyramids out the window, he does all this, puts the right stuff on her. Goes to Sven and Erica, the gallery owners, and he says, what do you think? And they said, cool. Put it up in the show and everything's successful. Now the photographer finds this same Miss Jones. She's a very popular model all of a sudden. Everybody's finding her. And he tries to make her Cleopatra, but that's not going to work. She's going to be Miss Jones. Now the painter can paint Miss Jones right in front of him and never see her. All he sees is the Cleopatra part. Pictures also, particularly if it's a film picture, there's a certain honesty in a frame, but what we don't see around it could totally change the meaning of it. And we always think of pictures as being of things. But great pictures can become things in themselves, icons or paragons in time. And pictures can tell stories. Here's a couple of pictures. One is a fashion picture, one is a kid working in a sweatshop. Nothing will tell that story. We all know the story like a photograph. We have a great woman writer of photography, Susan Sontag. They call her the Dark Lady of Letters, and you'll know why in a minute. But she refers to photography as not art or anything, it's evidence. And in order to take some pictures, it's like you have to anesthetize someone and stick a pin through them like a butterfly. Or that all photographs are memento mori. Every time you take a picture of someone, you participate in the mortality. Well, there are pictures that I see like that, but frankly, they bore me. I think as photographers, most of us want to do something that makes you feel something. If it's just plain beauty or joy or whatever, but photography can tell stories. The Native Americans called photographers shadow catchers. I always liked that term. I was fortunate, probably one of the few people in the world other than the Hopi tribe that's ever seen this, but I was invited to a rain dance on the Hopi Mesa. This was a July day without a cloud in the sky, no 100 degrees, no precipitation. 35 snake priests came out with live rattlesnakes in their mouth and they danced and they prayed for rain for the growing season. Halfway through this ceremony, it was like Cecil B. DeMille's The Bible. The sky erupted, it hailed on the mesa, it rained until the end of the ceremony. As city people, we think we know all the answers to everything, but I'll tell you, you've experienced something like that, it's pretty cool. One of my favorite photographers did a series on the North American Indian about 100 years ago, Edward Curtis. This is one of the most beautiful documentaries ever done, but it ends up in the basement of field and history museums. You can almost smell the formaldehyde when you're looking at these pictures in these dingy little rooms. And there are fascinating cultures still out there that I'm involved with that I don't want to end up there. I want them to get where people can see them. And that's why I created this enormous camera that takes negatives that are 6 feet tall, that pictures are 24 feet tall with perfect reproduction. We're used to 10 or 15 megapixels in our world. You know, Duke University created a digital monster that'll do 30,000 megapixels. They've calculated this camera to be the equivalent of about 97,000 megapixels, but it's all analog, which is very beautiful. So what's all this mumbo jumbo about? Basically, we're coming to a tipping point. We have come to the end of film. It's probably the last film project. Urban sprawl is absorbing these delicate little cultures on the periphery. Our greatest generation are in the 90s, and the world's losing a language every 2 weeks. So I don't care what we call it, but I'm hoping we can freeze some of this for future generations so we don't forget about it. When I came back from Vietnam, I was befriended by an Indian chief from the Lumbee Tribe. It's a long story, but somehow, he realized I had a few issues, and he think he was big brothering me or something like that. And he said, you're not really ready for prime time. Why don't you come and live with the tribe for a while? We could use some photographs for our archives. And, you know, you can just like chill out and relax a little bit. And I said, I've been in the Army 3 years, I got to get back to work, man. So I went back to Chicago. A couple of weeks, I flipped the car around, went back and moved in with the tribe, lived there for 6 months, hunted, fished, we fixed things, we chopped wood, we picked corn, whatever had to be done, and I got a chance to get back into photography and photograph these amazing people. At the end of the time, I felt pretty good. You know, I'm not perfect, never will be, but I was ready to go back, you know, and I could have been in therapy for the rest of my life or hunted and fished for a few months. You take your pick, you know. What about all the soldiers in Afghanistan now? Maybe a little segue on a dude ranch might help them out a little bit, okay? So I don't know if any of you have been scuba diving, but you got to be careful for the barracuda. They're nasty little suckers. You know, they go for shiny objects. If you got a ring or something like that, you can lose a finger. And I think as a culture, we're becoming a little bit like that. You know, we're into the apps, you know, the 15 minutes of frame is probably down to 15 seconds now. And I was worried about the exhibit being only interesting to people that like photography or anthropology, so I became aware of some fascinating technology that I married with technology, education, design, art. Well, I don't know where they came from, but anyway, to make this project into that shiny object mode. So we'll take a camera and a truck, we'll go around the country, photograph 50 cultures for a year, come back, create this nomadic exhibit that's involved with texture and totally interactive. Even to get into the thing, you have to walk through a face that's projected on smoke. Then the next thing you'll see is a room like this, just torrential rain coming down. You see some pictures kind of in the back. But you can't get to them unless you walk through the rain. But the computer knows where you are. So you walk through a rain room to see a water culture like Cajuns without getting wet. And then the next thing you do is you hear this great blues music and you see this gigantic howling blues man with his mouth wide open that actually is a door that you have to walk through to get to the next culture, which might be Native American. In addition to the great faces around, you'll see a pyramid made of glass with a hologram of a medicine man chanting. And I don't know how you can ever get closer to that culture than being near something like that. So basically, we'll get everybody together for a couple of hours into a venue that makes us understand our culture and other people's culture. It may be a little empowering to everybody. So remember, physiognomy is junk science. Cool looking, but junk science. If you want to know someone, look into their eyes. That's where you find the beauty. Pictures are not inconsequential.